Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Bandish, founder of The Curious Mindset, a private community for technology leadership teams powered by 64 Tech, an IT solutions provider across hardware, cloud, IT services, data, and AI. Now, while 64 Tech powers us, the strength of this community is its people. Together, we're building a world where no technology leader leads alone. We exist here to help technology leaders become the best versions of themselves, because the most challenging part of leadership isn't the technology, it's the people. And as you know, in a fast-moving world, most technology leaders are stuck in reactive mode, firefighting issues, buried in strategy decks, and chasing delivery, until the space to grow quietly disappears. That's why we built the Curious Mindset. It's a private, invitation-only community that brings together technology leadership teams and connects them with exceptional minds who share perspectives on leaderships. No membership fees, no sales pitches, just a space to learn, connect, and grow through shared curiosity and honest conversations. Please do follow our 64 Tech LinkedIn page for updates. And if a partnership with 64 Tech could support your tech team, or if you're ready to shake things up with your IT suppliers, please use the link below to book a call in with me. Now, this community was born out of my own experiences. I know what it feels like to lead in isolation, and I don't want others to go through it alone. I'm going to go slightly off script for a moment, particularly for anyone joining us today who's not been on the origin of the Curious Mindset session. Today marks 13 years since we started 64 Tech. And in the early years, I took the business into the wall about 3 times, not because of a lack of opportunity, but because I struggled with things like hiring, understanding behaviors, understanding characteristics, and being perfectly honest, I didn't understand leadership. The latter is still, like many of you here today, a work in progress. And the reason I'm sharing that is because the Curious Mindset didn't come from theory. It came from real mistakes and hard lessons, and from a belief that leadership is better when you're not figuring it out alone. So going back to my script, our guiding belief here is simple: together we grow. And if you believe in what we're building, please stay connected and share it with others. This community grows through invitation and reputation, and it only works when we build it together. Our community is also on WhatsApp, making it even easier to stay connected and join the conversation. Please follow the link below or reach out to Bryony directly. Now it's my pleasure to hand you over to our host, Andy McMenemy, our resident technology leader co-host, Steve Maxwell, and our special guest, Hywel Carver. Thank you.
Vanish, thank you so much. And again, as I always say, thank you for your generosity through 64 Tech in supporting and developing the Curious Mindset community. We had a fantastic year last year, and I'm fairly confident this year will be equally as exciting. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the year today. And we're going to be talking about how to completely fail at learning. It's my great pleasure to introduce to the community Hywel Carver. Now, Hywel was a former CTO at Skillaware, and he's going to help us understand why does learning so often fail to translate into real behavioral change, especially for tech leaders. Hywel, welcome to the Curious Mindset.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here. I'm very, very excited to be here.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm having a little bit of a technical issue. Sorry, 1 second, because Hywel hasn't actually been brought onto the stage yet. Bear with.
You're still very welcome, Hywel.
I'm just adding.
Can you hear me okay?
Sorry,
we can absolutely hear you, and I can see you on the screen. So there we are. We're side by side. Hywel, welcome to the Curious Mindset. And I'm so excited to learn from you today on this subject of how to completely fail at learning.
Absolutely, yeah. Really happy to be here talking about it, and yeah, and happy to dive in, and also looking forward to people's questions later.
Yeah, so go straight into the subject for us. Help us to understand then, why does learning so often fail to translate into behavioral change? What's been your research? What's been your understanding? And you share your wisdom with us.
Yeah, well, I think that our default approach to learning is not a good one. The default approach to learning, I think, that we take relies on, thank you for the compliment on the Lego, relies on us, relies on individuals being highly motivated, relies on people translating information they receive into abilities and behaviors, relies on people sitting through things that are very boring. And ultimately, this just doesn't make for a good experience. If I think about when I have learned most in my life, it has not been in boredom. In fact, I think that boredom is pretty much the exact opposite of learning. And there are multiple frameworks for thinking about learning, multiple bits of research that we can draw on. One of those frameworks is called the affective model, the affective context model for learning. And essentially what that means is that you learn by going through some kind of emotional experience while doing something. It is that emotion that helps us learn. And sometimes that can be a positive thing, right? I did this thing and then I ended up winning the race. Now that sort of feeling of positivity is going to change, is changing how I prepare for races next time, for example. It can be negative. I did this thing, this person got angry with me. I'm going to learn not to do that again. Boredom is the absence of emotions. So for me, boredom is almost by definition a moment when we cannot be learning. And yet, if you think about the default ways that we give people to learn, which are very often things like watching videos or reading books, where essentially we are competing against Netflix for their time and attention, we are going to lose compared to watching like the latest episode of Squid Game or whatever. It is more boring to sit through a video about something. I think it's also the case that there's this big translation step that is missing. We treat learning as if we just need to give people enough information. If only they knew this stuff, if they had this resource, it would turn into these behaviors, this ability to make decisions. And the reality is that that isn't how our brains think about learning, how our brains work. We can't just translate new information into abilities overnight or immediately. And I think, in fact, Bandish touched on this in his introduction, that a lot of like the learning comes from doing. If we want people to get skills and wisdom, they need experience. If you think about how people learn best, typically that is by experience. Most people don't say, I was taught by a book. If they used a book or a video, they would say, I taught myself to do this thing. And that is reflective of the fact that we recognize that that is not where the learning really happened. The learning happened when you tried to do the thing and closed the feedback loop. So I guess my summary, I realize I've answered your question in very long form here. My summary is that the reason we fail at learning is partly because the approach we take isn't designed for success. I think we also measure learning in a very weird way, though. So when people take on learning initiatives, often the way that they measure learning is by things like completion rate or by attendance rate. And this is, to be clear, this is not a very favorable way of looking at learning. If you look at MOOCs, like massively online open courses, a typical completion rate for a MOOC course would be around 10%, like double digits is a good completion rate, which is a terrible statistic if you're relying on that learning for anything meaningful. We also look at things like confidence, but typically the thing that we were aiming for in learning is the kind of behavior change that you were talking about. We want to see productivity change. Maybe we have some hypothesis that the organization is going to move faster if everyone can make this change. We can have full stack developers, or we can adopt this technology, or we can change the way that we work. Measuring that based on completion rates of a course feels weird to me. Like, why aren't we measuring the success of learning by those outcomes that we actually care about, and working back from there instead of saying, well, everyone had access to the video, 14 out of however many people, 14% of people watched it, so that's our success measure. I think if you want learning to be successful, you have to really start from the end goal and work backwards from there.
I think the long form answers are superb because they're bringing lots of context. And I think that's really important, Hywel, is that we get the context behind this. And I'm hearing that, experiential learning is the best way because the brain naturally feels curious, right?
Yeah, I think this is it. Like, curiosity is a very natural instinct, and following that is honestly what I think makes us human, like that drive to learn. The actual learning then happens when we do something, typically. Certainly when we talk about skills and abilities, if someone told me that they had learned to drive a car by reading books and watching videos of people driving cars, I don't think I would feel safe being their passenger. I would feel much safer if they had had driving lessons and hopefully passed some kind of driving test that validated that those lessons were successful. And I think this is generally true of skill. We learn to do skills by trying them, by following that curiosity and doing the thing, not just reading about the thing. Reading about the thing and gaining that information, super interesting, a really important starting point for trying it. But to actually learn, we have to do it.
That's a great point. And I guess using that analogy that you shared there about learning to drive a car, when we start to learn that process of understanding the control mechanisms, the safety mechanisms, the roads around us, it's very much a compliance type of learning, isn't it? We're having to comply with the legislation and the safe driving practices. But I know for sure if I was to sit my driving test now, I probably wouldn't be so compliant because I've learned to take shortcuts. How does that influence our ability to embed, good learning principles in behavioral change that lasts?
Well, I think you identify something really important there, which is about the needs of learning. And so when people sit a driving test, we're really evaluating them on multiple axes. Are they able to comply with the rules of the road? But also, are they able to drive safely? And so the rules of the road, at least when I was learning, and I think this is still the case, there's a theory test. You read it. I had a little like light blue colored book that was the highway code. You need to know what that kind of road sign means specifically. You need to know if a driver does this with their arm out the window. I think that one means slowing down, but I might be wrong on that. There was a time when I knew those things. I had to memorize stopping distances so that I could pass that compliance test. And sometimes that is what we need, right? If you are ISO certified, for example, you will have an obligation to put people through regular security training. And that typically means making sure that they have gone through some form of learning, passed a test at the end. I think that is quite a different thing from making sure that your team are writing secure code. The kind of compliance type learning, the learning that we would turn to for GDPR compliance, ISO compliance, whatever, SOC 2 compliance, whatever it is, that is a different thing from the learning to actually be more secure, to actually follow the processes. So when learning to drive a car, even if you didn't know what any of the road signs meant, you still need the knowledge of what the different pedals do. If you move that stick up on the left, it's going to indicate right. If you move it down, it's going to indicate left. All of that knowledge is important for then being able to practice the skill of driving. But until you start practicing that skill, I would not say that you have learned to drive. You might learn how the mechanics of a car work. And to be clear, there is a software parallel for this, right? You can learn the syntax of a language. You can learn the structure of an LLM. But until you are actively applying those things and gaining that experience, I would not say that you are learning how to write in that language or learning how to use an LLM to write better code.
That's a great analogy. And I suppose it sits very well alongside of the adaptiveness of learning, because some people, may have learned to drive a manual car, but have never transitioned to automatic. And now we've got the advent of electric. They're all different skills of learning to, safely navigate the vehicle. And I guess in our current environment, we are similarly facing that challenge with AI. It's adaptive learning, isn't it?
So I think there's an even bigger point, which is I think all learning should be adaptive, honestly. So this is another reason why learning becomes very boring, is when we don't do this. A lot of learning is based on a factory model. Internally in Skill Aware, I've tried to semi-ban the word course, because a course to me sounds like a series of things where everyone has to do the same learning. And that is the factory model, the kind of Taylorist approach of take a unit of work and put it through these processes, and we will get it from A to B at the end, which is a great way to train an LLM. It's a great way to train an AI system, and it makes for an efficient process. but it's a terrible way of learning because you are forcing people to go through things that are boring for them. So if we take your example of moving from, say, petrol to electric cars, making people go through a new bit of learning for electric cars, but it's from scratch learning to drive a car that happens to be electric, would very clearly be boring for them because there's a small bit in the middle that's actually useful. And then all the beginner stuff and all the kind of judgment on the road stuff that comes later would be irrelevant to them. And in fact, if I lean on a couple more models for learning, some of the things that we learn best are the first things that we learn and the last things that we learn. So if you have a 8-hour day of learning, people will typically remember best the stuff at the beginning and the stuff at the end. So for this model where all you really needed was in the middle, you have really wasted a lot of people's time and wasted their ability to remember certain things especially well by not focusing on the things that are relevant for them. If you can abandon that course model and focus learning where it's actually both tailored to the individual and they're only learning things they don't already know, but also that are relevant to them, where they can see how learning is going to help them almost immediately. You go from learning that feels like being a unit of work in a sort of grim industrial revolution factory to feeling like a superpower, to feeling like you're already great, we're going to make you even greater, and you're going to be this kind of hero at what you do coming out of it. And you mentioned as well about like AI. I mean, I think this is a time in technology where change is everywhere, right? A career in technology is a career in change. It's a career where everything is evolving always. The kind of technologies that were mainstream at the start of my career look very different now. I wouldn't have ever predicted that JavaScript would go away, but now everyone is writing TypeScript. I thought jQuery would have lasted forever, but no, like we abandoned jQuery. There are new better ways now. That has changed significantly. And what we were saying before, I think the shift of being a developer before there was an internet to now is probably a similar sort of seismic change compared to a developer pre having AI-based tooling to help you develop better to now, where there are so many ways to use AI and it feels like there is so much potential there.
And I suppose just listening to that point, there is a place, I guess, for standardized courses that give a level of competence that can be measured as a base level to build upon. But I'm reminded of a situation where I was interviewing a while ago in my old career, which was ironically motor trade, and people would often present with 20 years of experience. And then when you probe a little bit to say, well, have you got 20 years of growth experience, or is it 1 year that's been repeated 20 times and you haven't really developed your skills? What's the latest techniques you've learned? And I guess even more so, that's kind of enforced, I would imagine, in the tech world, because, as you say, the rate of pace of change is so rapid that to be relevant, you have to be consistently growing.
In general, I think that is very much true. I still come across people who are like maintaining that same bit of COBOL since the 90s. And, that same mainframe that they look after has not had a second of downtime in the last 20 years. So that role still exists, but my goodness, there are very few jobs like that. For most of us, it is constant change. It is keeping up with the competitor next door who is doing more stuff. But I think you touch on a really interesting point as well, which is this years of experience as a measure is a very bad one, because, as you say, it might even be 3 months of experience where you learned everything in that 3 months, and then you've really not been learning new stuff at all. So when we talk about learning by experience, it has to be doing something new. Actually doing the thing is how you learn something new. Repeating it helps to refresh that memory, but you don't actually grow by just doing the same things again and again and again. The growth comes partly by that curiosity, partly by exploring new ideas, and partly by the kind of actually implementing them and seeing that feedback loop happen. And I think that's a really key part of this, is thinking about those different forms of learning, because if we start again with compliance as the endpoint, sometimes you do just have to sit through the training on that bit of legislation every year, because that's what we're required to make you do. Sometimes learning, I think, can be for inspiration, in which case really what we should be trying to do is bring someone who can inspire, who can make the topic exciting. And then maybe the way that we measure it isn't completion rates so much as sentiment. We look at before people were feeling generally negative about that topic, the reorg, the change of technology. And now they're feeling generally positive. They're seeing the benefits, and they're happy that the trade-offs are being made in the right way. If what you're looking for, though, is transformation, if what you're looking for is a change in behaviors and abilities, something that's typically going to impact productivity, then I think that's when you need to be very granular, very focused on skills, and evaluating not by people's years of experience, but by specifically what things do they do now? Which bits of learning can I carve out and say, you don't need to be in that. That's a waste of your time. You're going to be bored. And honestly, you're probably going to ruin it for everyone else if you're present in that learning because they want to learn and you already know it. That's the point when you need to be very focused, because that is learning that is harder work. That's learning where people are going to have to be really stretching themselves, taking new ideas, trying them and applying them, being willing to make mistakes and to grow from a feedback loop. And that's where we want people to be learning new skills, and that's where we need to focus their time.
That's really interesting. I read an article not long ago on feedback, and I think the article was paraphrased as saying the profession that gets the most immediate feedback and is constantly at the cutting edge of learning and development immediately are surgeons, because their feedback is literally, if the patient dies on the table, I need to learn. And that's quite a dramatic learning curve. But how as technology leaders then might we be able to introduce curiosity and experiential learning, which is fun, to help our teams embed that learning and make it more permanent?
Yeah, so I think the point about surgeons is a really interesting one. I mean, we get that feedback quickly as developers, but very often with much less catastrophic results, right? If failing tests are a small problem compared to having a patient, die on an operating table, but that feedback loop exists. Sometimes, though, that with development, the problem can just be that you made a mistake, right? You knew how to do the thing right. Often, I think the way developers learn is through pull requests, through reviews from peers. There's something very important about doing something and getting feedback on that thing and using that to improve next time. So provided you are then limited by the sort of ceiling of what your reviewer peers know, but that is often what we rely on for developers to learn. I've generally found developers to be people who are excited by learning. As a rule, every developer I've ever hired has said that they want to learn and grow. What I find a lot of is people who don't want to be trained. Like, as a general rule, this is an industry where people are very excited about learning and do not want to spend a single second of time being trained. I think that is because of what we were talking about before, that most training is not really set up to be exciting, to feel empowering, to feel like it's making people genuinely grow. And so I think actually the answer to inspiring people and motivating them and bringing and getting them to be curious often comes back to taking away the things that are suppressing that, which look like making them sit through videos, making them sit through talks, which they might be interested in the subject matter, but they would rather go and just like write some code and try it for themselves. So yeah, I think that's my answer to the question. Is generally we have more things that are suppressing people's motivation that we need to remove than things that we need to add.
So what's a great piece of advice you could share with our tech leaders on how to do that more effectively, Hywel, from your experience perhaps at SkillAware, where you help tech leaders to embed that knowledge and make it a capability that was then used on a daily basis?
Yeah, so I'll talk about how we work as a company, but I would say that all of these ideas are very copyable, and you can take this exact framework and emulate it yourself. So it still applies. For us, I think the first step is to find those fine-grained skill gaps early on. So when we talk about any technology, any curriculum that we have, any area of learning, we want to break it down into the smallest component parts so that people are not wasting time on learning stuff that they already know or that isn't relevant for them. So if you have a team of developers that you want to grow in an area, I'd say the first way to start is by thinking, how can I break that down into much smaller chunks? So if you want to improve their abilities to be architects, exactly what areas of architecture are you considering? Is it domain-driven design? Within domain-driven design, do they understand what a bounded context means or not? It's that level of granularity that you want to be going to, like individual topics that you could or could not cover with them. And in terms of filling those gaps, firstly, focus only on ones that are going to be relevant and useful to them. Teaching people stuff that they aren't going to be able to use really risks those ideas atrophying before someone gets to use them, which ends up meaning that people will feel bored in the session because they know that they're not going to get a chance to use this idea before it's gone from their head. And then all of the learning, I think, needs to be focused on being hands-on. There is a minimum level of information that you need to impart for people to have a go. But the really key thing is that they use the ideas and do something creative with them in order to learn. I'm going to reference another learning framework that I like a lot, which is called ICAP. The ICAP framework says that certain modes of learning get better results than other modes of learning. The first one, the strongest, is I for interactive. That means doing something with other people. So like building a thing and having some kind of feedback loop, some kind of social element to it is important. That gets better results than constructive learning, which is where you build the thing, but you don't have that community around you. You don't have that sort of peer relationship involved in the learning. That is better than active learning, which is where you are consuming some kind of content, but you're interacting with the content while it happens. Maybe you're highlighting a bit of a Medium article. That highlighting action makes that into active learning, rather than the worst form of learning, passive learning, which is really content consumption. So when learning skills, when you're trying to improve people's judgment and make them more able, you want to focus right at that early end, interactive learning. You can learn information pretty passively. If any of you watched The Traitors last night and I asked you who was the secret traitor, that was 2 days ago now, don't spoil it for everyone else, but you would know the answer to that. You have that learning. You gained that passively. You just watched a thing, but you retain the information. Knowledge is super easy to gain passively. Skills, not so much. To learn skills, you have to do the thing, and you learn them better by having other humans around you when you do it. So focus the learning there. If what you want looks like a skill or ability or even a behavior change, then focus learning on people doing and applying and then getting some kind of feedback from an expert, because that is how we learn skills best.
It's fascinating. How I'm curious, something that's you've triggered in my mind is that learning, when we think about it in the workplace right now, we probably have 4 generations across the age groups. And is there one standardized method of teaching or encouraging people to learn that would sit across all? Or do we have to adapt it now for the younger generations coming into the workforce? Do they learn in a different way?
I haven't seen evidence of a difference in the needs for learning. So some of the models that we have for learning are widely debunked. One example is the idea that there are different types of learners, that like there is a visual learner who learns by seeing stuff, or an auditory learner, or a kinesthetic learner. Mm-hmm. Actually, multiple groups have tried to prove that again and again. And what we find is that people have personal preferences, but they actually don't change the learning outcomes. So you might prefer reading something, you might prefer watching a video, but in terms of your ability to learn from that, it's probably going to be the same regardless of who you are. One thing that does seem to be constant, though, is that we all learn best by doing. A common thing that is talked about as a difference between generations is attention spans. That there's certainly, I think there is research that younger generations have shorter attention spans than older generations. that's going to make a big difference if what you're doing is passive learning. If you're giving people resources to consume, then yes, people who are newer to the workforce are likely on average to have shorter attention spans, to find it harder to get through that content and stay alert and focused on it. The same thing doesn't happen if you are learning by doing. Doing is not a struggle to keep your attention on it. It involves you. And honestly, it's very often exciting. It is a fun form of learning that makes you feel like you are improving, where a lot of passive learning feels like working out which bits to memorize so I can speed run the questionnaire that comes at the end.
What would be your go-to method of teaching then, if you were going to be teaching or training people to learn something that's relevant to the industry?
So I think it really depends on what we are trying to learn. And in fact, maybe I can share screen. There is a model that is a framework for thinking about learning that I guess some people will have come across before, called Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is a way of thinking about the different outcomes from learning. And the idea is that we have to kind of start at the bottom and build up from there. There are different versions of this. Sometimes you'll see create at the top and evaluate second. But the idea is that we have to know some information in order to be able to understand it. And we have to be able to understand it in order to be able to apply it. We have to be able to apply it in order to be able to analyze a situation and work out how we're going to apply it. And if you want to evaluate what something else has done, what someone else has done, and give a value judgment on it, give them feedback, or come up with totally new creative ways of solving problems, then you need to start at those lower levels first and build up. My view is that there are different forms of learning going on here. And one thing I think about a lot is the difference between information and skills, abilities, and wisdom. So I would draw a distinction between knowing information, having skills and being able to do things, and then having good judgment. To me, those are all different forms of learning. Once you take that view, you then think about learning them in different ways. So information, generally not that useful for work because we can Google stuff or we can look things up in Confluence. Really useful for quizzes. I'm a big pub quiz fan. I've been on a few TV quiz shows. I've done a lot of knowledge learning, like just memorizing stuff because it's useful for quizzes. Like I was on University Challenge, decided to become the team's world geography expert. There was a time where I knew not just like the capitals and flags of all the countries of the world, but I could roughly knew where different rivers flowed in European countries, and I could point to where the capitals were. That I just crammed in because if those questions came up, I wanted us to be able to do them. That stuff is not useful in the workplace, though. That it's rarely relevant to me, right? We care much more about skills, and to learn skills, we have to do them. We have to apply that knowledge in order to grow the skill. That's where that interactive and constructive learning by doing, ideally with others, comes in. Improving judgment, I think, relies heavily on a feedback loop. So if you imagine setting the strategy for your organization or knowing how you're going to conduct a particularly difficult meeting, given the personalities and the challenges involved, those come down to your judgment. Having done some of those things before, you will have a different opinion about how to do that in this situation. And so in order to learn judgment, in order to learn wisdom, I think we need to close that feedback loop. We need to have that experience of doing things multiple times and being able to reflect on them. But also I think communities like this one, I think are very valuable for that, because hearing that someone else had the same problem, solved it in a different way, and understanding why their way was a good idea for them and maybe your way in a different situation was a good idea for you, is one of those ways that we build up that judgment, that wisdom, that ability to make good situational decisions. I'm going to stop sharing now.
No, that's fascinating.
Zoom moves my window around when I share screens, so I'm going to stop sharing. It's more comfortable like this.
I guess the difference with knowledge and experience is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, but not to put it in a fruit salad.
Yeah. Well, yes, although you can know not to put it in a fruit salad, right? It's there's an interesting thing about wisdom where particularly smart people are able to turn their wisdom into knowledge for others. So if you think about every decision-making framework you've ever seen, every kind of set of principles, that is someone who has had lots of experience, lots of wisdom born of that experience, where they've realized why they're making the decisions they are, spotted the patterns and turned it into something that the rest of us can follow. So that sort of wisdom turning into knowledge is an interesting phenomenon. If you memorize a framework, a set of principles, you get some of the benefits of that. I don't think it makes you as wise as the person who created it, but I think it lets you kind of borrow their wisdom a little bit and gives you a kind of beginning point to apply. You still have to grow the skills yourself, and as you do them more, you might start to come up with your own ways of doing things that are better, because you see the shortcomings of the framework, or you see the nuances where it doesn't apply. I once had this was described to me by a jazz trumpeter called Pat Harbison as imitate, assimilate, innovate. We start by copying other people and copying their wisdom until we internalize it, and then we can start being creative, doing things our own way. And there's a similar thing, I think it's the martial art Aikido has a principle of shu ha ri, where the sort of initiates are just copying the instructor until they can become the instructor and kind of copy them exactly, and then start to innovate, doing things in their own very different way.
It's that confidence becoming competent, isn't it? Once you've learned it and you've practiced it, as you say, you've imitated it, then you have the confidence to be able to explore a little bit, and then you become competent at adapting those things. In a moment, I'm going to invite Steve to come in, because I know there's lots of nodding heads in the gallery, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions. But before we do that, Hal, I'd like to ask you, when you look forward now in the landscape ahead of us over the next year, and with the rapid pace of change, what type of information can you share with our community here today that might give them a little bit of steerage on where the cutting edge is as far as learning is concerned, and what you're curious about with AI and how it's implementing itself, what we need to look for in the future that we could perhaps get ahead of the learning curve on?
So I think I'm nervous to talk about the cutting edge. I don't have any special insight into what the labs are working on. It does seem to me like we are still in a place where there are categories of problems that LLM and sort of transformer-based architectures are much worse than humans. Those problems still exist, which is good. We still have a place in the world. I think that the new normal that I am seeing is developers becoming more like commanders and reviewers, people who give the AI instructions, review it, and give feedback on it. One of the things that means, if I go back to Bloom's taxonomy, what that means is every developer now is operating at quite a high level where they are constantly in evaluation mode. We used to care about developers in applying mode, which is third from bottom in Bloom's hierarchy. We needed developers who could take the ideas and do work with them. Now we need developers who are much more focused on evaluating, because they're going to do the work less themselves, and instead they're going to instruct AIs to do the work for them and evaluate the results. That means we need developers who have a higher order of thinking about their work. The developers who are just writing code to solve problems and not really thinking about the way that they were doing it, or not thinking architecturally, or letting other people do that thinking for them. Now, actually, we don't have such a strong need for that skill set. We need the people who are always thinking about the right way to solve the problem, because that's where the AI is not so strong. And that's where we need the humans who can both set that direction and who can evaluate the results and say, and be critical about them. That's, I think, is what the focus of an engineering career is going to turn into. I've seen the predictions, like everyone else has, that all software development is going to be done by AI. I don't see that coming true myself. I think the gradual improvements we're seeing feel like they are hitting a plateau, which I think is the natural limitation of what you can do with a language model alone. And so what's interesting to me to think about is the role of humans in that, and how we prepare people for it. Because in in a world where we've relied on people learning by doing and getting feedback from other developers, their ability to become good architects, their ability to become good users of AI systems when they aren't actually writing the code or writing the systems, is a really interesting new challenge. It's one of the things we've seen the biggest uptick as a result of, because now people need people who are skilled enough to review code in maybe languages or frameworks or technologies that they haven't ever written entire projects in themselves, which is an interesting new kind of direction for the industry.
Thank you so much, Hywel. That's been fascinating. I think this is the right and appropriate time to ask Steve to step forward, because as our resident tech leader, I'm fairly confident Steve's got some great questions, and I can see there's lots of nodding heads and questions coming up in the chat. So Hywel, thank you so much so far. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Steve to the format. Steve, would you like to step forward?